The pen scratched across parchment like a death rattle. Jake Mason's hand trembled as he signed his name below the widow's neat script. The contract binding him to a woman 30 years his senior, while the bank's foreclosure notice burned in his vest pocket. 3 days. That's all his family ranch had left. "Stop!" Margaret Thornton's voice cut through the judge's office. She stood abruptly from the leather chair, her black bombazine dress rustling like crow wings. At 55, her face carried the kind of beauty that comes from surviving rather than adorning sharp cheekbones. Silver threading through auburn hair pulled severe, eyes the color of winter sage. "Something wrong, Mrs. Thornton." Judge Harlan peered over his spectacles, the marriage certificate half complete on his desk. She moved to the window, studying Main Street below where curious townspeople had gathered, drawn by gossip that young Jake Mason was selling himself to save his land. "Mr. Mason, what do you know about how my husband died?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Railroad accident. 2 years back." "Is that what they're calling it?" She turned, and Jake saw something in her expression that made his spine straighten, not grief, but the kind of careful control that comes from holding secrets that could get you killed. "Judge, we need complete privacy." Judge Harlan's face went pale. "Margaret, I don't think... now." The judge left his own office, closing the door with the soft click of a man who'd learned not to ask questions. Margaret crossed to the oak desk, her fingers hovering over the marriage contract. "I'm not buying a husband for companionship, Mr. Mason." "Bye, Michelle." She pulled a brass key from her bodice, moving to a painting of the town founders on the wall. Behind it, a hidden compartment clicked open. "I'm buying protection." She withdrew a leather portfolio, setting it before him. Inside, survey maps covered in red ink annotations, railroad company letterheads, and what looked like property deeds, dozens of them. Jake's breath caught as he recognized family names: Rodriguez, Watts, even the Harrisons who owned the mercantile. These prove the railroad has been systematically stealing land through forged surveys. My husband gathered this evidence. Her finger traced a dark stain on one document. That's his blood. The accident happened the day after he refused their bribe. Jake stood slowly, his father's teachings about honor warring with the instinct to run. "Why haven't you taken this to the federal marshals?" "Because Judge Harlan signs the forged deeds. Sheriff Collins enforces the evictions. Bank President Morrison holds the fraudulent mortgages." She met his eyes. "The only reason I'm still alive is that they don't know where James hid these documents. But they're getting desperate. Last week, someone broke into my house while I was at church. And you think marriage will protect you? A widow alone is vulnerable. A married woman has legal standing, a witness in her own home, someone to speak for her if she disappears." She pulled out $500 in worn bills, spreading them across the desk beside the documents. "This saves your ranch. That ring makes you my legal protection. But if you sign that certificate, you're choosing a side in a war you didn't know existed." Jake picked up one of the surveys, recognizing his own ranch's boundaries except they'd been shifted 3 miles east, encompassing the water rights that made the land valuable. According to this, his family had been squatting on railroad property for 15 years. "They're coming for everyone," he breathed. "Starting with the vulnerable, the widows, the Mexicanos, the ones without connections." Margaret's voice carried exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. "James thought he could fight them through proper channels. I know better. But I need time to get these documents to someone who can act on them. Someone outside their reach." Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Margaret quickly closed the portfolio, shoving it back into the hidden compartment as the door opened. Not Judge Harlan, 3 men Jake didn't recognize, all wearing city suits despite the frontier heat, all carrying the particular stillness of men who solve problems with violence. Mrs. Thornton, the leader, a thin man with pale eyes, smiled without warmth. "Mr. Colton from the railroad company." We heard you were getting married again. Wanted to offer our congratulations. How thoughtful. Margaret's tone could have frozen whiskey. Colton's gaze swept over Jake. Dismissive. Young husband. Must be expensive. Keeping a ranch running these days. All those debts to pay. His eyes returned to Margaret. Your late husband had some papers that belonged to the railroad. Company property. You understand. We'd like them returned. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Colton moved closer, his companions flanking him. James was very thorough in his record-keeping. We've searched his office at the railroad, his storage at the bank. That leaves your house. Or perhaps... He glanced at the judge's painting. Other locations. Jake stepped between them. My wife said she doesn't know about any papers. Colton's smile widened. Your wife's certificate isn't signed yet. Boy, it will be. Will it? Colton pulled out a different document from his coat. Funny thing about marriage contracts, they require both parties to be legally competent. And according to this physician's assessment, Mrs. Thornton has been suffering from hysteria and delusions since her husband's death. Seeing conspiracies where there are only accidents, Judge might hesitate to marry her off to someone taking advantage of her mental state. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Dr. Paulson would never. Dr. Paulson left town this morning. Family emergency back east. Might be gone for months. Colton set the medical assessment on the desk beside the marriage certificate. His replacement, Dr. Fitzgerald, is very concerned about your welfare. Thinks you might need institutional care. Unless, of course, you recover those missing papers. Memory can be funny with hysteria. Things forgotten might suddenly be remembered. The office door opened again. Judge Harlan entered, his face ashen. Gentlemen, I need to complete this ceremony. Of course. Colton tipped his hat. We'll let you proceed. But, Mrs. Thornton, we'll need those papers by week's end. For your health. You understand. They filed out. Colton pausing at the door. Oh, and young Mason? Your ranch's water rights are being reviewed. Surveying error, apparently. Shame if you lost access to Settlers Creek. The door closed with deliberate softness. Judge Harlan's hands shook as he picked up the pen. Margaret, I had no choice. They have evidence about my son's gambling debts. Just complete the certificate, and Thomas? Jake signed his name again, this time with steady hands. Margaret added hers, and Judge Harlan witnessed it with the reluctance of a man signing his own confession. The moment the ink dried, Margaret turned to Jake. We need to leave. Now. They exited through the judge's private door, avoiding the crowd gathered out front. Margaret led him through back alleys to where a covered wagon waited. Rosa already at the reins. As they climbed aboard, Jake glimpsed what lay in the wagon bed under heavy blankets, boxes of ammunition, provisions for travel, and a rifle case he recognized. That's my father's Winchester. How did you... I bought it from the pawn shop last month. Margaret pulled back a corner of blanket, revealing something that made Jake's blood chill, a freshly carved coffin, adult-sized, with Margaret's name already etched on the pine lid. Found it in my barn this morning, she said quietly. They're done being subtle. Rosa snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched toward the Thornton house. As they rounded the corner, Jake saw smoke rising from the direction of his family ranch, black smoke, the kind that comes from buildings burning, not campfires. Margaret gripped his arm. I'm sorry. I thought we had more time. But Jake wasn't looking at the smoke anymore. He was staring at what Margaret had pulled from beneath her skirts, a second leather portfolio, identical to the one in the judge's office. You showed me the copies, he said slowly. The originals are hidden where even I can't get them alone. She pressed the portfolio into his hands. If something happens to me, there's a map in here, but Jake retrieving them might be a one-way journey. Behind them, hoofbeats thundered as riders approached fast. Too many to be friendly. Margaret reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a Navy Colt, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency. Can you shoot? She asked. Jake took the gun, his wedding ring catching the light as he cocked the hammer. My father taught me. Good. Margaret pulled out a second pistol for herself. Because I don't think they're coming to wish us well on our wedding day. The riders crested the hill 8 men, all armed, led by Colton himself. But it wasn't the guns that made Jake's chest tighten. It was what Colton held high in his right hand, a federal marshal's badge, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Mrs. Thornton, Colton called out. By the authority of the federal court, you're under arrest for murder. Margaret's face went white as parchment. She turned to Jake, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw real fear in those sage-green eyes. Jake, she whispered, they found James's body. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The wagon wheels locked as Rosa hauled the reins. Dust billowed up, coating Jake's throat with alkali grit. 8 riders fanned out in a practiced half-circle, cutting off escape routes. The federal badge in Colton's hand caught sunlight like a brand. James Thornton's body was discovered this morning in an abandoned mine shaft, Colton called out, his pale eyes fixed on Margaret. Bullet hole in his skull. Interesting thing, the railroad reported him dead 2 years ago in that tragic accident. Seems someone's been lying. Margaret's knuckles went bone white around the Colt's grip. Jake felt her breath quicken against his shoulder rabbit fast. Trapped. The coffin in the wagon bed creaked as Rosa shifted her weight. You can't arrest someone for their husband being murdered, Jake said. Can't I? Colton produced a folded paper. Witness saw Mrs. Thornton at the mine the night James disappeared. Another saw her burning bloody clothes. And then there's the life insurance policy, $20,000 she collected based on a false death certificate. The riders drew closer. Jake counted ammunition in his head, 6 shots in the Navy Colt, 6 in Margaret's gun. Not enough. The witness. Margaret's voice came out steady despite her racing pulse Jake could see in her throat. Would that be Dr. Paulson, the one who suddenly left town? Colton's smile faltered for half a heartbeat. Or perhaps Banker Morrison, she continued. Interesting how your witnesses are all men who signed those forged land deeds. Thunder rumbled across the valley. First drops of rain struck Jake's hat brim. In the wagon bed, the coffin's pine lid darkened with moisture. Rosa's hands moved slow, deliberate, toward something beneath her shawl. Federal marshals don't ride with hired guns, Jake said, studying the men. 2 had prison pallor. 1 wore Mexican spurs worth more than a lawman's monthly pay. These aren't deputies. Boys observant, the rider with expensive spurs said. His hand drifted toward his holster. Colton's manufactured authority crumbled. Dead or alive? The warrant says, your choice. Mrs. Thornton? The portfolio pressed against Jake's ribs where Margaret had shoved it inside his shirt. Maps that could destroy powerful men. Evidence worth killing for. Again. Rosa spoke for the first time, her Spanish accent thick. Señora, the storm. Jake turned. A wall of black clouds rolled toward them, prairie lightning walking on stilts of white fire. But that wasn't what made his gut clench. Behind the storm, more riders approached. Too many to count in the rain-hazed distance. Margaret saw them too. Her finger found the trigger. Mr. Colton, you asked about those papers. Changed your mind about cooperating? No. She aimed not at Colton, but at the coffin in the wagon bed. Just wondering if you knew James kept dynamite in his workshop. 3 sticks should be enough, wouldn't you say? Rosa. The Mexican woman pulled back the blanket, revealing red-wrapped sticks nestled against the coffin wall, a lit cigar clenched between her teeth. Bluff, Colton said, but his horse sensed his fear, dancing sideways. James taught me about mining, Margaret said. Taught me that sweating dynamite is unstable. That coffin's been sitting in hot sun all morning. Rosa brought the cigar close to a shortened fuse. The approaching riders were close enough now that Jake could make out details, except they weren't riding toward them. They were fleeing from something. The fleeing riders weren't fleeing, they were herding. 500 head of longhorn cattle crested the ridge, their horns spanning 6 feet tip to tip, dust and thunder merging with the storm's approach. The lead steer's eyes rolled white with panic. Lightning struck a dead cottonwood not 50 yards away, and the herd veered straight toward Colton's semicircle of men. "Stampede!" One of Colton's gunmen screamed. The formation shattered. Horses reared, throwing 2 riders. Colton fought to control his mount as the ground vibrated with approaching hooves. Rosa whipped the wagon team forward into the chaos, the coffin sliding against its ropes. Jake grabbed the wagon's side rail as they lurched between scattering gunmen. A longhorn's horn scraped wood inches from his thigh. The smell of cattle fear piss and musk and prairie grass flooded his nostrils. Margaret fired once into the air, using the sound to steer panicking steers away from their wheels. Through the dust, Jake saw Colton's horse go down. The man rolled clear, his federal badge disappearing under 1,000 hooves. When the herd passed, nothing remained but churned earth and that expensive Mexican spur, bent into scrap metal. Rosa drove hard for 3 miles before slowing. The storm broke overhead, rain washing dust from Jake's eyes. Margaret's hand shook as she lowered the colt. "The dynamite," Jake said. "Was it real?" Rosa spat out the cigar. "Candles wrapped in red paper. Señor. But men see what they fear." 4 days later, Jake's new wedding ring caught on the church door handle. The metal was still foreign against his skin, like everything else about this arrangement. Margaret waited on the steps. Rain-darkened bonnet, hiding her expression. "Ready." Her gloved fingers touched his sleeve, light as moth wings. Through the door glass, Jake saw the congregation already seated, every pew full for Sunday service unusual for August. Word had spread about their wedding, about Colton's disappearance in the stampede, about federal marshals asking questions in town. Jake opened the door. Conversations died like someone had cut telegraph wires. 60 pairs of eyes tracked them down the center aisle. Women pulled children closer. Men's hands twitched toward absent sidearms church rules forbade weapons during service. The front pew, traditionally theirs since Jake's grandfather built this church, sat empty. As they approached, Mrs. Harrison stood from the row behind, her black taffeta rustling like accusations. Her husband owned the mercantile, the hotel, and enough cattle to buy respectability despite rumors about his business practices. "This pew's taken," Mrs. Harrison said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Margaret's spine stayed straight as a fence post. "Of course, we'll find another seat." They moved to the second row. The Hendricks family suddenly needed to leave. "Elizabeth feels faint," Mr. Hendricks muttered, though his daughter's cheeks blazed with health. Third row, same reaction. By the 4th attempt, sweat ran down Jake's collar despite the morning cool. The entire church watched their humiliation parade. Margaret's breathing changed shallow, controlled. Jake recognized it from watching his mother endure his father's drunken rages. The kind of breathing that keeps you from screaming. "Back corner," Margaret whispered. "The Negro section." 3 families who worked the railway sat separated by an invisible line no one crossed. They shifted, making room. Their eyes holding sympathy Margaret couldn't accept without crumbling. Preacher Williams climbed his pulpit, knuckles white against worn wood. Today's reading comes from Proverbs, about virtue. His eyes flicked to Margaret. "A virtuous woman, who can find? For her price is far above rubies." Someone coughed. It sounded like murderer. Jake's fist clenched. Margaret's glove found his hand, her touch saying, "Don't," without words. Her fingers were ice through the thin leather. "Some women," Preacher Williams continued, sweat beading his upper lip, "mistake virtue for, other qualities, wealth, perhaps, the ability to purchase what should be freely given." Mrs. Harrison's fan snapped open. "Amen." The sermon twisted scripture into accusation for 40 minutes. Jake counted Margaret's breaths, 22 per minute, never varying. When they stood for hymns, she sang clear and true while whispers rustled around them like snake scales. After service, the congregation bottlenecked at the door where Preacher Williams shook hands. The crowd parted around Jake and Margaret like they carried typhoid. Mrs. Harrison positioned herself by the donation box, her circle of women forming a gauntlet. Margaret, Mrs. Harrison's voice carried theatrical sympathy. Such a tragedy about poor James, found in that mine shaft. Though I suppose you knew that already. Didn't you? Margaret's fingers tightened on Jake's arm, not seeking support, warning him to stay quiet. I identified his body yesterday, Margaret said evenly. The federal marshal needed someone to confirm it was James, despite the decomposition. 2 years of decomposition. Yet you collected his life insurance 2 years ago. How enterprising. Mrs. Harrison's smile could have curdled milk. Tell me, did young Mr. Mason know he was marrying a murderess when you bought him? Or was that extra? The church went silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Jake stepped forward. Margaret's grip became iron. My wife, Jake said, voice carrying to every ear, spent yesterday identifying her husband's remains. A man murdered and thrown down a shaft while someone else filed false papers about a railroad accident. The only crime here is that it took 2 years to find him. Your wife, Mrs. Harrison laughed, brittle as old glass. Boy, she's old enough to be your mother. What she paid you won't last long enough to make sharing her bed worth. Mrs. Harrison, Margaret's voice cut through clean. I believe you have a letter in your reticule from the bank about your husband's loan. The older woman's face drained white. Her hand moved involuntarily toward her purse. James kept excellent records, Margaret continued, including which merchants were claiming false losses on insurance, inflating damaged goods claims after fires. I'm sure Marshal Brennan would find that interesting reading. The fan in Mrs. Harrison's hand trembled. Margaret walked through the women's circle, Jake beside her. At the door, Preacher Williams avoided their eyes. Outside, rain had started again, soft against the church steps. They'd made it 10 feet when Jake noticed the stranger. He stood across the street under the hotel awning, sketching in a leather journal despite the rain. City clothes, but worn rough. When he looked up, Jake saw the kind of face that had stared down gun barrels and lived scarred jaw, eyes that missed nothing. The stranger tipped his hat to Margaret, not mockery, recognition. Margaret, Jake whispered. That man, I know. Her voice carried fear Jake hadn't heard even facing Colton's guns. That's James's brother, the one who's been in federal prison. The man closed his journal and started walking toward them, rain streaming off his hat brim like a veil. The stranger stopped 3 feet away, rain pooling in the brim of his prison-pale hat. A scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, the kind made by sharpened spoons in cells where guards didn't venture. Hello? Margaret. His voice carried Midwest flatness ground down by years behind bars. Been watching since yesterday. You've gotten careful. Robert. Margaret's fingers dug into Jake's forearm through his Sunday coat. I thought you had 3 more years. Good behavior. Robert Thornton's laugh scraped like a rusty gate. Governor needed my cell for someone important. Banker who got caught with his hand in the wrong till. Church doors opened behind them. The congregation spilled out, conversation dying as they registered the stranger. Mrs. Harrison clutched her husband's arm. Parents pulled children back inside. Robert's gaze swept over Jake, cataloging age, stance, the new wedding ring, the way Jake had shifted to partially shield Margaret. So this is the boy you bought. Jake's jaw locked. Margaret's grip tightened. Wait. We should continue this privately, Margaret said. The house James bought you or the ranch you bought him. Robert pulled out his leather journal, pages swollen with rain. I've been reading James's letters, the ones you sent to me in prison. Interesting how you never mentioned he was dead. Sheriff Collins emerged from the church, hand on his holster. 2 deputies flanked him. Robert didn't turn, but his shoulders adjusted, a man used to tracking threats without looking. "Mrs. Thornton," the sheriff called. "This man bothering you? Family conversation." "Sheriff," Robert said, still watching Margaret. "About my brother's murder." The word hung in the rain-soaked air. Collins' face went tight. "Federal marshals cleared Mrs. Thornton yesterday. Did they—" Robert finally turned, and Jake saw why prison hadn't broken him. His eyes held the patient madness of a man with nothing left to lose. Or did Marshal Brennan just say there wasn't enough evidence to hold her? Different thing entirely. Margaret stepped forward, rain streaming down her black bonnet. "Robert, please, come to the house. We'll explain everything." "Explain!" Robert's scarred jaw worked. "Explain how my brother's body spent 2 years rotting in a mine shaft, while you collected his life insurance, while you lived in his house, spending his money." Jake moved between them. "That's enough." Robert's attention fixed on Jake with reptile focus. "Boy, you don't even know what you married into, do you? Ask her about the bruises. Ask her why James started drinking. Ask her about the doctor visit she hid from everyone except good old Rosa." Margaret's breathing hitched. Jake felt her sway, caught her elbow. Her body trembled under the bombazine dress, not fear. Something else. "Tomorrow," Robert said, backing away. "I'll come tomorrow. Have those papers ready. Margaret, the real ones James wrote about. Or I'll tell Marshal Brennan what I found in your barn this morning." He walked away through the crowd that parted like he carried plague. Margaret stood frozen until he turned the corner toward the hotel. Then her knees buckled. Jake caught her weight, her body burning with fever through the rain-soaked dress. "Rosa," Margaret whispered. "Get Rosa." The Thornton house sat on 40 acres of prime bottomland, 2 stories of timber and stone that spoke of money earned, not inherited. Jake half-carried Margaret through the front door while Rosa ran ahead, shouting in rapid Spanish to the housemaid. "Bedroom," Rosa ordered. "Senora needs—" "No." Margaret pulled free, standing despite the tremors racking her frame. "The study. We have work." She led them to a room lined floor to ceiling with ledgers, maps, and agricultural journals. Rain hammered the windows. Margaret lit the oil lamp with shaking fingers, then pulled down 3 leather-bound books. "Your ranch," she said, opening the first ledger. "Every expense for the last 5 years. Every cattle sale. Every loan payment. Every bag of seed." Jake stared at his father's handwriting interspersed with Margaret's neat annotations. "How did you—" "I bought your father's debt 6 months before he died." Margaret opened the second ledger. "Here every ranch within 50 miles. Their loans, their water rights, their tax assessments." The third book made Jake's chest tighten. Survey maps, but not the official ones. These showed actual boundaries, water tables, soil quality. Margaret's fingers traced the creek running through his property. "Drill here." She tapped a bend in the creek. 20 feet down, you'll hit artesian water, enough to irrigate 30 acres even in drought. That's solid limestone. For 16 feet, then clay, then water-bearing sandstone. She pulled out a geological survey dated 10 years back, margins filled with James's handwriting. "Your grandfather knew. See, he started drilling but gave up too shallow." Jake studied the maps, seeing patterns which ranches failed in dry years, which thrived, which got bought by the railroad at bankruptcy prices. Margaret had tracked it all, predicted it, prepared for it. "Why?" Jake asked. "Why learn all this?" Margaret moved to the window, lamplight catching silver threads in her wet hair. James was a good man, but naive. He thought honesty would protect him. When the railroad started falsifying surveys, he gathered evidence believing the law would save us. Her reflection wavered in the rain-streaked glass. "I knew better. So I learned everything, every ledger, every legal precedent, every weakness our enemies had." Rosa entered carrying a tray coffee, black, Margaret's medicine bottle. A slice of dried apple pie that smelled of cinnamon and last autumn's harvest. She set it down, her eyes meeting Jake's with warning. Margaret poured coffee, her hands steady now. Your father came to me last Christmas. The bank was calling his loans. I offered to buy the debt. Give him time. He never said, pride. Margaret handed him the cup, their fingers brushing. He had too much. You have just enough. Jake tasted the coffee strong, bitter, with a hint of chicory, like his mother used to make. You knew I'd need help. I knew the railroad would come for every vulnerable ranch, young owner, no family support, drowning in debt. She gestured at the ledgers. You were perfect prey. Thunder shook the windows. Margaret picked up a pen, showing Jake columns of numbers, projected expenses, estimated yields, market prices for next season's beef. See here, if you sell steers in September instead of October, you lose 3 cents per pound. But if you wait until November, the Army contract renewals, they pay premium for winter beef. Jake leaned closer, smelling lavender soap under the wet wool of her dress. How do you know about military purchasing? James's brother Robert was a supply sergeant before prison. Margaret's voice caught on his name. He taught us about government contracts, how to read between the lines of requisitions. They worked through the ledgers as rain drummed the roof. Margaret's fever seemed to break, color returning to her cheeks. Jake found himself watching her hands thin, marked with ink stains, moving with precision across pages. Not soft hands, working hands that knew their business. Here, she pulled out a fresh ledger, binding uncracked. This is yours. For the ranch going forward. Jake opened it. The first page bore his name in Margaret's copperplate script, and below it, projections for a sustainable operation. Every page mapped out the next year when to buy, sell, plant, harvest. She'd planned his survival in detail. This must have taken weeks. Since February, Margaret's voice went quiet. Since I knew your father was dying. Jake set down the ledger. You knew. The doctor told me, consumption advanced. Your father swore him to silence. She met Jake's eyes. I promised to look after the ranch, after you. The coffee turned to ash in Jake's throat. His father had known, had arranged this, had died believing Margaret would save the land he'd killed himself trying to keep. I would have managed without... No. Margaret's interruption came soft but certain. You wouldn't... Look. She showed him the final pages, tax assessments due, loans called, cattle prices falling. You had perhaps 2 weeks before bankruptcy. The marriage gave you legal protection. Time to restructure the debts. Jake stood, pacing to the window. His reflection stared back, young face, old eyes, wedding ring alien on his work-roughened hand. Behind him, Margaret waited, patient as stone. The bruises Robert mentioned. James hit you. Margaret's silence stretched like pulled taffy. When Jake turned, she was rolling up her left sleeve. Scars marked her forearm, thin, precise, the kind made by broken glass or careful knives. Not James, she said. James tried to stop them. The railroad men who came asking about the documents. James interrupted them. Her fingers traced one scar. That's when they decided he had to die. Jake crossed the room, knelt beside her chair. This close. He could see the exhaustion she carried like another garment in the lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she held herself ready to run, even sitting still. Robert thinks you killed his brother. Robert knows I failed to save him. Margaret's voice broke. First crack in her armor Jake had witnessed. That's worse. Rosa knocked, entered without waiting. Her face had gone gray. She held an envelope, rain-spotted and mud-stained. Under the kitchen door, Rosa said. No one saw who? Margaret opened it with steady fingers. Inside, a single sheet. As she read, blood drained from her face. She handed it to Jake. 5 words in block letters. The widow burns tomorrow night. Below. A crude drawing the Thornton house in flames. 2 figures trapped inside. One tall, one shorter. Both marked with X's for eyes. Margaret stood, moved to the lamp, and held the paper to the flame. It caught, burned, fell to ash in the metal tray. "Pack the essential ledgers," she told Jake. "Only what we can carry. We're running." "No." She pulled a key from around her neck, unlocked a drawer Jake hadn't noticed. Inside, a navy Colt and a small leather pouch. She opened it, dynamite blasting caps. The real thing this time. "We're going to the mine. Tonight. Before they do." Jake stared at the blasting caps. "What's in the mine?" Margaret loaded the Colt with practiced efficiency. "Besides James's body, the rest of the evidence. And Robert doesn't know about the second shaft." The mine entrance gaped black against the hillside, 15 miles from town through terrain that punished the wagon's axles. Jake tasted copper in his mouth, fear, or the metallic air that seeped from the shaft. Margaret sat beside him, rifle across her lap, scanning the ridgeline. Rosa held the reins, her knuckles pale in the moonlight. "There," Margaret pointed to a cluster of juniper 50 yards upslope. "The second entrance." Jake saw nothing but shadow and scrub brush. The main shaft where they'd found James yawned, obvious as a scream. This other entrance Margaret claimed existed was invisible. They tied the horses to a dead pine. Margaret led them up the slope, counting steps under her breath. At 37, she stopped, knelt, and pulled aside a tangle of tumbleweeds. Behind them, wooden planks covered a hole barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. "James dug this." Her fingers traced the plank's edges. "Connected to the main shaft 40 feet in. He'd enter through here, exit below. Anyone watching would think he'd been in town." Jake helped her pry up the boards. Stale air rushed out, carrying the smell of bat guano and something else, machine oil. Recent. Margaret lit a lantern, adjusted the wick until yellow light pooled steady. "I'll go first," Jake said. "No." Margaret was already lowering herself into the hole. "The path's trapped. Watch where I put my feet." Jake followed her down rough-cut steps into darkness. The walls pressed close, cold through his shirt. Rosa came last. Another lantern swinging from her belt. 20 feet down, the passage opened into a natural cave. Stalactites dripped calcium tears. Margaret's light caught on something metallic wire stretched ankle-high across the passage. "Step over," she said. "It's connected to dynamite in the ceiling." Jake's boot cleared the wire by inches. The cave narrowed again, forced them to duck. Support beams appeared, roughly hewn but solid. Professional mining work. They descended until Jake's ears popped from pressure change. The passage opened into a chamber carved from living rock. Shelves cut into walls held wooden crates, each stenciled with railroad company markings. A desk occupied one corner, papers spread across its surface. Against the far wall, a Wells Fargo safe squatted like an iron toad. Margaret set her lantern on the desk. In the shifting light, Jake saw what the papers were: contracts, surveys, correspondence, all originals, all bearing railroad company letterhead. She opened one crate. More documents, bundled and labeled in James's precise writing: land transfer fraud. Forged signatures, bribery records. 5 years of evidence, Margaret said. "James spent every evening here after he realized the sheriff was searching our house." Jake picked up a contract. His own family name stared back a deed transfer he'd never seen, dated 2 weeks from now, selling the Mason Ranch to the railroad for 1/10 of its value. His signature already forged at the bottom. They prepared these in advance, dozens of them. Margaret pulled out a leather portfolio. Every small ranch, every Mexican holding, every widow's plot, just waiting for the right moment to file them. Rosa made a sound warning. Boot steps echoed from the main shaft, not trying for quiet. Jake drew his Colt, but Margaret caught his wrist, shook her head. She pointed to a gap between crates where shadows pooled thick. They killed the lanterns, pressed into darkness. The footsteps grew louder. Light flickered on the chamber walls, someone approaching from the main tunnel. Jake's finger found the trigger guard. Beside him, Margaret's breathing went shallow. Robert Thornton entered carrying a bullseye lantern, its focused beam sweeping the chamber like an accusing finger. He moved straight to the desk. No hesitation. He'd been here before. "I know you're here. Margaret." His scarred face looked skeletal in the harsh light. Horses outside. Fresh scratches on the entrance boards. Margaret stepped from the shadows. "Hello, Robert." He spun, hand going to his waist, but no gun appeared. Prison had stripped him of carrying rights. "Where's the boy?" Jake emerged, Colt visible but not aimed. Robert's eyes tracked the weapon with the attention of a man who'd lived where violence came sudden. "Protective. Isn't he?" Robert set down his lantern, pulled out his leather journal. "Did you tell him yet about the baby?" Margaret went still as the stone walls. Robert flipped through pages. "James wrote me every week, even mentioned the pregnancy. Spring of '79, then suddenly, no more mention. Baby died. Didn't it? Or did you? Stillborn?" Margaret's voice came out flat. "The doctor said it was the beating. The beating you never reported. The one that happened right after James found these documents." Robert gestured at the crates. "Interesting timing." Jake stepped closer to Margaret. Felt her trembling increase. Not fear, rage, controlled and cold. "They came for the papers," Margaret said. "James was in town. They thought I'd break easier." Her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach. "I was 6 months along." Robert's expression didn't change. "James never mentioned anyone attacking you." "Because I never told him they caused it. He blamed himself enough for bringing danger to our door." Margaret moved to the safe, worked the combination. "You want the truth? Here." The safe door swung open. Inside, tied bundles of letters, a daguerreotype in a silver frame, and a cloth-wrapped package. Margaret pulled out the photograph herself, younger, standing beside James. A visible pregnancy curved beneath her dress. 3 days after this, railroad men came, Collins, Morrison, and 2 others I didn't recognize. She set the photograph on the desk with steady hands. They wanted James to stop gathering evidence. I told them he was in Denver. They didn't believe me. She unwrapped the cloth package. A tiny christening gown, never worn, spotted with brown stains, blood, old but still visible. I bled for 3 days. Rosa helped me deliver him perfect, beautiful, dead. Margaret rewrapped the gown with infinite care. We buried him behind the house. James never knew the beating caused it. I told him it was God's will. Robert's journal dropped from his fingers. Margaret, you think I killed James? Her voice stayed level. I killed him every day for 2 years, watching him drink himself toward the grave, knowing it was grief for a child whose death I could have prevented if I'd just given them the papers. Jake heard horses outside many, moving fast. He crossed to the entrance, peered into the main tunnel. Torches bobbed in the darkness, voices echoing off stone. Company, he said. Robert grabbed his journal. Railroad men. Someone must have followed you. Or you, Margaret said, already gathering critical documents. The second entrance. Fire exploded through the main tunnel. Not torchlight, actual flames, liquid and spreading. Kerosene poured down the shaft, ignited, racing toward them. The upper exit. Margaret shoved papers into a canvas bag. Move. They ran for the narrow passage to the second entrance. Firelight chased them, smoke already thickening the air. Jake pushed Margaret ahead, Rosa behind her. Robert came last, coughing in the poisoned air. The wire trap. Jake remembered just as Margaret stepped over it. But Robert, running blind in smoke, His boot caught the wire. The explosion shook dust from the ceiling, not the trap that hadn't triggered yet. This came from above. The second entrance collapsing in a rain of stone and timber. Their escape route vanished in rubble and dust. Fire crept into the chamber behind them, eating oxygen. Smoke layered thick at the ceiling, forcing them to crouch. Rosa pulled her shawl over her mouth, eyes streaming tears. "The main shaft," Robert gasped. "Only way." "They'll be waiting." Margaret's face showed no panic, just calculation. "Unless—" She grabbed the blasting caps from her pocket, the ones she'd taken from the house. "The connecting tunnel. Between here and the main shaft, there's a limestone wall. Natural barrier, but thin. Blast through." Jake caught on. "Create a third exit. Or bring the whole mountain down on us." Margaret was already moving, leading them to a section of wall that looked identical to every other. She ran her hands over stone until she found what she wanted, a hairline crack running floor to ceiling. "Here, weakest point." Jake helped her wedge blasting caps into the crack, while Robert and Rosa piled crates as a barrier. The fire grew louder, closer, consuming the evidence James died to protect. Margaret lit the fuse with shaking fingers. 90 seconds of cord. They retreated behind the crates. Jake pulled Margaret against him, her back to his chest, shielding her as much as possible. Rosa pressed close on one side, Robert on the other. The fuse sparked toward the wall, racing against the approaching fire. 30 seconds. Smoke filled Jake's lungs like wet wool. His eyes burned, tears streaming. 20 seconds. The main chamber was fully ablaze now, crates of evidence turning to ash. 10 seconds. Margaret's fingers laced through Jake's, her wedding ring hot against his skin. 5, 4, 3, 2. The explosion felt like God's fist through the mountain. The limestone wall vanished in a cloud of white dust and flying stone. Jake's ears rang, blood trickling from his nose, but through the destroyed wall, moonlight, cool air, a way out. They stumbled through the gap onto a ledge 20 feet above the valley floor. Below, riders circled the main mine entrance, torches in hand. Jake counted 12 men, all armed. Sheriff Collins's voice carried clear in the night air. "Burn every entrance, nobody survives." Margaret pulled Jake back from the edge before they were spotted. To their left, a narrow game trail wound down the cliff face. To their right, sheer drop. "The trail," she whispered. They edged along the ledge, single file, stone crumbling under their feet. Jake heard shouts someone had noticed the explosion's dust cloud. Torchlight swung toward the cliff. A shot cracked against stone inches from Jake's head. They'd been spotted. "Run!" Margaret pushed Rosa ahead, the older woman surprisingly agile on the narrow path. More shots. Robert grunted, stumbled. Blood spread dark across his shoulder. Jake caught his arm, kept him moving. The trail switchbacked down, each turn exposing them to gunfire. They reached the valley floor running. Their wagon sat 200 yards away, horses dancing nervous from the gunfire. No cover between here and there except sagebrush and shadow. "Margaret," Collins's voice boomed. "Give us the documents and you walk away." Margaret didn't slow. 50 yards to the wagon, 40, 30. The horses screamed. Jake saw why riders had circled behind, were cutting the traces, scattering their animals into the night. They were trapped in the open. Collins's men spread out, closing in, nowhere to run that wouldn't get them shot in the back. Margaret stopped, turned to face the approaching riders. She pulled the canvas bag from her shoulder, held it high. The documents, the only surviving evidence. "You want these?" She pulled out a lantern they'd saved, still lit, and held the flame near the bag. "Come closer and they burn." Collins raised his hand, halting his men. "Now, Margaret, let's discuss this reasonable-like." That's when Jake saw it movement on the ridgeline. Not Collins's men. These riders moved silent as shadows, spreading out along the high ground. Moonlight caught on metal rifle barrels, trained on the sheriff's party below. Margaret saw them too. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or recognition. "Sheriff Collins," she called out. "You might want to look up." Collins turned in his saddle. 20 rifles stared down at him from the ridge. The lead rider urged his horse forward, and Jake recognized the federal marshal's badge before he recognized the face Marshal Brennan, the one Robert had mentioned. But it was the man beside Brennan that made Margaret's intake of breath sharp as breaking glass. Railroad company suit, city hat, pale eyes Jake had seen before. Colton, very much alive, despite the stampede that should have killed him. Colton descended the ridge on foot, favoring his left leg. Dirt caked the side of his face where hooves had missed his skull by inches. His pale eyes fixed on Margaret with the patience of a man who'd crawled from under 500 cattle and tracked them for days. "Mrs. Thornton," his voice carried raw from dust and rage. "Federal Marshal Brennan would like those documents." Marshal Brennan rode forward, a thick-bodied man with mutton chops gone gray. His badge caught moonlight as he positioned his horse between Collins's men and Margaret's group. Nobody moves, nobody shoots. First man to draw iron gets dropped. Collins's hand hovered near his holster. "Marshal, this woman murdered her husband." "No," Brennan said. "She didn't." The sheriff's mouth worked empty air. "But the body shows Mr. James Thornton was shot with a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. Mrs. Thornton owns a .44 Navy Colt. Different gun. Sheriff, we checked." Brennan shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "Interesting thing, though. You carry a .38 Collins." Jake felt Margaret's weight shift against him. Her breath came quick, shallow. The canvas bag of documents hung from her left hand, lantern flame dancing near the oil-soaked fabric. Robert pressed his palm against his bleeding shoulder, teeth clenched. "Then who?" "Me, Morrison," the bank president, emerged from behind Collins's group. His banker's suit looked wrong here, too clean, too pressed. He held a matching .38 steady in his soft hand. "James wouldn't see reason," Morrison continued. "Kept gathering evidence, threatening to expose everyone. Bad for business. The railroad pays well for cooperation, Marshal. Better than the federal government, certainly." Brennan's expression didn't change. "Keep talking." "Why?" "You already know." Morrison's gun swung toward Margaret. "James hid those documents somewhere. Spent 2 years looking. Then his widow announces she's remarrying. Needs to settle the estate. Figured she'd have to produce them eventually." Collins's horse sidled nervous. "Morrison, shut your mouth." "No point now." The banker's laugh had a hysterical edge. "Marshal's got us surrounded, brave. But those documents burn. We all walk free. No evidence, no crime." Margaret raised the lantern higher. Smoke curled from where flame nearly touched canvas. "Everyone stays back." "Margaret," Brennan said carefully, "I need those documents to prosecute. Without them, these men go free to try again." Her voice carried exhaustion deeper than physical. "Jake, take Rosa and Robert to the wagon." "I'm not leaving." Her fingers found Jake's wrist, squeezed once. "Please." Jake understood. She was giving him an out, a chance to walk away from whatever came next. He didn't move. Colton limped closer. "Touching. But federal marshals have been bought before." He looked at Brennan. "Haven't they? Marshal? Like that incident in Kansas. What was her name, the witness who died in custody?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "Ancient history. 3 years ago." Colton pulled out a telegram from his coat. "Railroad company knows about your gambling debts. Marshal. 100,000 to Chicago syndicates. They're willing to pay." The federal deputies on the ridge shifted, uncertain. Jake heard triggers being cocked, but couldn't tell whose side was preparing to fire. Rosa spoke from behind Jake, her Spanish accent thick with fear. "Señora, the sun comes soon." She was right. The eastern sky showed pale gray above the mountains. Dawn maybe 30 minutes away. The documents in Margaret's bag, weeks of James's careful work, fluttered as morning wind started. "Here's what happens," Colton said. "Mrs. Thornton burns those papers. We all ride away. No one dies today. Except the families who lose their lands, Margaret said. Progress has costs. Colton's scarred face showed no emotion. The railroad brings prosperity. Towns grow. Some people lose so others prosper. Robert laughed, wet and bitter. Blood had soaked through his shirt, spreading like spilled ink. That's what you told James before you had Morrison shoot him. Morrison's gun swung toward Robert. Your brother was naive, thought law meant justice. But law is what men with money say it is. Jake saw Margaret's finger move on the lantern, adjusting the wick, flame growing brighter. The canvas bag's bottom corner was starting to char. Marshal Brennan, she said, if I give you these documents, can you guarantee prosecution? Brennan hesitated. That hesitation said everything. That's what I thought. Margaret looked at Jake. I'm sorry. For all of it. The marriage, the danger, the lies about protecting the ranch. It was really about protecting these. She lifted the bag. And I've failed. Margaret, Jake started. She dropped the bag into the lantern flame. Fire erupted upward, canvas and oil creating instant inferno. Papers inside caught immediately, 5 years of evidence turning to ash in seconds. Margaret held the burning bag high like a torch, her face lit orange in the flames. Morrison lowered his gun, laughing. Stupid woman, you just freed us all. Collins grinned. No evidence, no crime, like Morrison said. But Margaret was smiling too, and Jake recognized that expression, the same one she'd worn showing him the dynamite that was really candles. She dropped the burning bag, stepped back as flames consumed it. You're right, she said. Those documents are destroyed. Then we're done here. Collins turned his horse. Except, Margaret continued, those weren't the originals. Every man froze. Margaret pulled open her coat. Strapped to her corset were oilcloth packets, each thick with papers. James made copies of everything. 3 sets, one in the mine that burned, one I just destroyed, and one here. She began pulling out packets, holding them toward Marshal Brennan. Original contracts with forged signatures, railroad company correspondence ordering the frauds, bank records showing bribes. Morrison raised his gun again. I'll shoot. A rifle cracked from the ridge. Morrison's gun flew from his hand, his scream high as a child's. He clutched his mangled fingers, blood running between them. Nobody else moves. Brennan's voice carried authority now, doubt erased. Mrs. Thornton, please bring those documents here. Margaret walked toward the marshal's horse, Jake beside her. Each step felt eternal, waiting for another gunshot, for someone to break, for violence to erupt. But the morning had gone still, everyone suspended between darkness and dawn. She handed the packets up to Brennan. His thick fingers verified what they were: real documents, real evidence. His expression changed from suspicion to something like respect. Sheriff Collins, President Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and land fraud. You can't, Collins started. I can. I am. And Mr. Colton. Brennan turned to the railroad man. You're coming too. Attempted murder, conspiracy, extortion. Colton's scarred face showed no emotion. The railroad company has lawyers. They do, but they also have stockholders who don't like scandal. Brennan motioned to his deputies. Take them. The arrest happened fast, deputies swarming down, disarming Collins's men, shackling the 3 ringleaders. Jake watched Collins's face transform from arrogance to panic as iron closed around his wrists. Margaret, Robert said, swaying on his feet. The baby. You never told James. She looked at her brother-in-law, this broken man who'd spent years in prison, who'd lost his brother to these men's greed. Would it have helped adding that guilt to what killed him? Robert's knees buckled. Jake caught him, lowered him to the ground. The shoulder wound had bled through Rosa's makeshift bandage, spreading dark across his chest. Doctor, Jake called to Brennan. He needs no doctor in 20 miles, Brennan said. Best we can do is, I can help. A woman's voice from the ridge. A figure in a dark dress descended, carrying a medical bag. As she came closer, Jake recognized her Dr. Fitzgerald's nurse, except she walked with authority no nurse would claim. Dr. Sarah Chen, she said, kneeling beside Robert. Federal Marshal Service. I've been investigating the fraudulent medical reports about Mrs. Thornton. Jake stared. You're a doctor, but Fitzgerald said. Fitzgerald's been arrested in Denver. He never had a medical license. She opened her bag, pulled out surgical tools. The report claiming Mrs. Thornton was hysterical, forged, like everything else these men touched. Chen worked on Robert's shoulder with practiced efficiency. The sun crept above the mountains, painting the valley gold. Margaret stood apart from everyone, watching the light spread across land that men had killed for. Jake approached her, stopped when he saw her expression, not relief or triumph, but bone-deep weariness. It's over, he said. No. She turned to him, and he saw tears she'd never let fall before now tracking down her cheeks. Now I have to live with it. Behind them, Brennan was organizing transport for the prisoners. Collins kept protesting his innocence while Morrison had gone silent, cradled his destroyed hand. Colton sat on a rock, studying the sunrise like a man memorizing his last free morning. Mrs. Thornton, Brennan called. We'll need your testimony. Full account of everything. After my husband's funeral, Margaret said. The real one this time. Brennan nodded, then paused. The marriage to young Mason here. It's legal, but given the circumstances, annulment would be, that's between my husband and me, Margaret said, the word husband careful on her tongue. Jake felt the weight of that husband in name, stranger in truth. The ring on his finger caught morning light like accusation. They'd been married 1 week. It felt like a lifetime. Dr. Chen finished bandaging Robert. He'll live, but needs rest. And Mrs. Thornton. She approached Margaret, voice dropping private. I found James's medical records. The drinking, the decline. He knew what happened to the baby. He knew what they did to you. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. She pressed her hand to her mouth, muffling a sound that might have been a sob or a scream. Jake reached for her, stopped. Did he have the right? They wore rings, spoke vows. But what were they really? That's when he noticed Rosa. She stood apart from everyone, watching the arrested men being loaded onto horses. Her expression was strange, not relief, but calculation. She caught Jake watching, and for one moment, her mask slipped. She was afraid. Not of the violence just past, but of something still coming. Rosa turned away, but not before Jake saw her hand move to her pocket, touching something hidden there. A letter, maybe? Or Jake. Margaret's voice pulled his attention back. We need to go home. Home. The Thornton house that had been her prison, her fortress, her husband's tomb. Jake looked at this woman he'd married for money, who'd risked everything for justice, who carried ghosts he was only beginning to understand. All right, he said, offering his arm. She took it, her touch light as bird bones. They walked toward the remaining horses while behind them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the night's shadows, but not its secrets. As they reached the horses, Jake glanced back. Rosa was gone, vanished like smoke while everyone focused on the arrests. Only her shawl remained, caught on sagebrush, fluttering like a dark flag in the morning wind. The Thornton house stood dark against the noon sky. No smoke from the chimney, no lamp in the window. Jake reined in the borrowed horse 50 yards from the porch, Margaret rigid behind him in the saddle. Rosa should be here, Margaret said against his shoulder. Jake dismounted, helped her down. Her legs trembled exhaustion, not fear. They'd ridden 4 hours from the mine. Robert staying behind with Dr. Chen and Marshal Brennan. The federal deputies had promised protection, but promises felt thin as paper against the house's silence. The front door hung ajar. Splinters showed fresh around the lock kicked in from outside. Jake drew his Colt, pushed Margaret behind him. "Stay here." "No." She pulled the navy from her coat. "My house, my fight." They entered together. The parlor had been ransacked, books thrown from shelves, cushions slashed, horsehair stuffing scattered like snow. Margaret's breath caught, not at the destruction, but at what sat untouched on the mantel: James's photograph, the one showing her pregnant. Jake checked the study. Worse devastation here: ledgers torn apart, maps shredded, the desk overturned, ink pooled black across Margaret's Turkish carpet. But the hidden wall safe behind the founder's painting stood unopened, unmarked. "They didn't know about it," Margaret said. "This was rage, not searching." A floorboard creaked upstairs. Jake moved toward the stairs, Margaret behind him. Each step groaned under their weight. At the landing, they found Rosa's shawl, the one Jake thought he'd seen caught on sagebrush. It lay folded neat on the hallway table, a piece of paper beneath it. Margaret picked up the note. Her face drained white as she read. "Rosa's daughter," she whispered. "They have her daughter." Jake had never heard Rosa mention family. "Where?" "Mexico, a village outside Juarez." Margaret's hand shook, holding the paper. "She's 14. They've had her for 6 months, using her to control Rosa." Another creaked: the master bedroom. Jake pushed the door open with his boot. Rosa sat on the bed, rosary beads wrapped around her fingers. Blood spotted her dress, not hers. On the floor beside her lay Morrison's assistant, the one who'd kept the fraudulent books. His throat had been opened, neat as surgery. A straight razor lay beside him, pearl handle dark with blood. "Rosa," Margaret started forward. "Don't." Rosa's voice carried no accent. Now the Spanish inflection had been performance. "He came for the second set of books, the ones showing which families got paid to stay quiet." Jake kept his gun steady. This woman who'd served Margaret for 3 years had vanished, replaced by someone harder, older, dangerous. "Your daughter doesn't exist." Rosa stood, rosary beads clicking. "I have no children, never did." Margaret lowered her gun. "Then why?" "Because I had a sister." Rosa moved to the window, watching the road. She worked for the railroad company. Secretary to Mr. Colton, young, pretty, trusting. When she found irregularities in the books, she brought them to him. Thought he'd want to know about fraud in his company. Jake heard horses approaching, several, moving fast. He raped her. Then his men did. Then they threw her from a train outside Amarillo. Rosa's fingers traced the window pane. "Took me 6 months to find her body. Another year to get hired in this house, waiting for my chance." "You used us," Margaret said. "We used each other. You needed someone who spoke Spanish, could move through the Mexican community unnoticed, gather information. I needed access to the men who killed Elena." Rosa pulled something from her pocket, a list of names. Half were crossed out in red ink. Morrison's assistant was number 4. The horses reached the gate. Jake looked out. Not federal marshals. These riders wore rough clothes, carried rifles across their saddles, hired guns. "But whose friends of yours?" Jake asked Rosa. "I don't have friends." She moved away from the window. "But Morrison had insurance. Men paid to act if he got arrested." "How many?" "But 6, maybe 7. Rosa picked up the bloody razor, wiped it clean on her dress. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen. Stone walls. One entrance. Defensible." Margaret shook her head. "We'd be trapped. Better than being surrounded in a house with 20 windows." Rosa opened her dress collar, revealing a key on a chain. "Besides, the root cellar connects to something else." Heavy boots on the porch. Jake counted footsteps, definitely 6 men, spreading out to cover exits. "Mrs. Thornton," a voice called from outside, younger, nervous. "We're here for the Mexican woman. Send her out. Nobody else gets hurt." Rosa laughed, bitter as quinine. "They think I'm just the help." She led them down the back stairs, through the kitchen. The root cellar door looked like nothing rough planks over a hole. But underneath, stone steps descended into darkness. Rosa lit a candle, revealing a narrow chamber lined with preserved jars and hanging herbs. At the far wall, she used her key on what looked like solid stone. A section swung inward, a hidden door, expertly crafted. Beyond, another passage, this one brick-lined and heading toward town. "James built this," Jake asked. "James never knew." Rosa took another candle from a shelf. "I built it. Took 2 years of nights. Comes out in the abandoned brewery on 2nd Street. Glass shattered upstairs, windows being broken. Boots thundered overhead, searching. "Go," Rosa said. "Both of you." Margaret grabbed her arm. "You're coming with us." "No. Someone needs to slow them down." Rosa pulled out a bundle of dynamite reel this time. Jake could smell the nitroglycerin sweating through the wrapping. "This house has stood long enough." "Rosa. My name is Maria Elena Vasquez. My sister was Carmen. Remember those names?" She lit the fuse long enough for maybe 10 minutes. "Now go." Jake pulled Margaret into the tunnel. Behind them, Rosa climbed back up into the kitchen. They heard her moving furniture, barricading the cellar door. Then gunshots. Rosa had opened fire from the kitchen window. The tunnel ran straight for 100 yards, then curved. Jake's candle threw wild shadows on brick walls. Margaret stumbled, caught herself against the wall. Her palm came away, wet groundwater seeping through mortar. "She planned all of this," Margaret said. "Every moment." "Keep moving." They reached a junction, 3 passages branching off. Rosa hadn't mentioned this. Jake chose left on instinct. The passage narrowed, forced them to duck. Behind them, muffled by earth and stone, gunfire continued, then stopped. Jake counted seconds. The dynamite should have 8 minutes left, maybe 7. The passage ended at a wooden door, locked from this side. Jake kicked it open. They emerged into the abandoned brewery's basement, copper tanks looming like sleeping giants. Dust thick as flour covered everything. Upstairs, footsteps. Jake pulled Margaret behind a tank. Through cracks in the floor above, lamplight moved. "Spread out," a man's voice ordered. "Mexican woman might have sent them here." 3 men descended the stairs. Jake recognized one Collins deputy, Wilson, who'd supposedly been out of town during the arrests. The other 2 were strangers, both carrying shotguns. "Check every corner," Wilson said. "Morrison paid for results." Margaret pressed against Jake's back. He felt her heartbeat through both their clothes, fast but steady. The Navy Colt in her hand clicked as she cocked the hammer. Wilson moved toward their tank. 10 feet. 5. Jake could smell tobacco on him, whiskey sweat, horse leather. An explosion shook the building. Not close from the direction of the Thornton house. The dynamite. Early. Rosa must have shortened the fuse. Wilson spun toward the sound. "What the hell?" Jake moved. His fist connected with Wilson's jaw, dropping him. Margaret shot the second man's gun from his hand. The third raised his shotgun. But Margaret was already moving, surprisingly fast. Her gun barrel caught his temple, sent him sprawling. "The house," Margaret breathed. "Rosa." Through the brewery's broken windows, they saw smoke rising black against noon sky. The Thornton house was gone, reduced to burning timber and memories. Jake grabbed Wilson's collar, hauled him up. "How many more of Morrison's men?" Wilson spat blood. "Dozen, maybe more. Railroad company wants you both dead. Can't have witnesses." "The federal marshals. Brennan's headed to Denver with the prisoners. Won't be back for days." Wilson grinned through bloody teeth. "You're alone." Margaret pressed her gun to Wilson's throat. "The other men Morrison hired. Where are they?" "Coming." Wilson's eyes went to the window. "Every gun in 3 counties that needs money. Price on your heads is $5,000 each." Jake looked outside. Riders on Main Street, searching building by building, too many to fight. They needed another way out, another plan. That's when Margaret said quietly, "I know where to go." She pulled something from her corset, a telegram, folded small. Jake recognized Marshal Brennan's handwriting. Federal judge arriving Thursday. Full authority. Keep witnesses safe until then. Thursday. 3 days from now. Where? Jake asked. Margaret's eyes went hard as winter ice. The one place in this town no one would look for us. The one place everyone avoids. Jake understood before she said it. James's grave, the real one. He built something there before he died. Something even Rosa didn't know about. Outside, horses gathered. Men's voices called orders. The hunt was organizing, becoming systematic. Margaret looked at Jake, and for the first time since their marriage, he saw her afraid. Not of death, of something else. Jake, before we go there, you need to know something. About James. About how he really died. Wilson laughed, dark and wet. Oh, this is good. Tell him. Mrs. Thornton, tell your boy husband what you did. Margaret's gun hand trembled, but it wasn't guilt Jake saw in her eyes. It was fury. James isn't dead, she said. Wilson's bloody laugh scraped against the brewery walls. Tell him the rest, Mrs. Thornton. Tell him about the body in the mine. Margaret's gun hand stayed steady, but Jake saw the tremor in her other fingers. The afternoon light through broken windows caught dust motes spinning between them, each particle suspended like the truth she was about to reveal. The body they found. Margaret's voice came flat, emotionless. It wasn't James. Jake's chest tightened. The scorched coffee taste from that morning rose in his throat. Then who? A drifter. Similar height. Build. James found him frozen in the mine 2 winters back. Margaret's eyes never left Wilson's face. We kept the body preserved in the cold shaft. James knew they'd come for him eventually. Wilson spat blood onto the brewery floor. So where's your husband? Widow. California. Has been for 18 months. Margaret lowered the Colt slightly. We staged his death after Morrison's first attempt to kill him. The drifter's body, James's clothes, 2 years of decay enough to fool everyone. Jake felt the floor shift under his boots. Every conversation, every tear Margaret had shed, every moment of grief calculated performance. His wedding ring caught the light, suddenly foreign again. You lied. The words came out raw. Margaret finally looked at him. In her hazel eyes, Jake saw exhaustion deeper than any he'd witnessed. I protected him. And everyone else. James alive in California meant the railroad kept watching me, not searching elsewhere. It meant the documents stayed hidden. It meant 30 families kept their homes. Footsteps outside. Multiple boots on packed earth, surrounding the brewery. Jake counted at least 8 men moving into position. Through a crack in the wall, he glimpsed rifle barrels. Brought friends. Wilson! Jake kept his voice steady. Wilson grinned through bloody teeth. Morrison paid for insurance. Every gun in 3 counties who needs money. Margaret moved to Jake's side, close enough he felt her breath. The tunnel extends past the brewery, comes up near the livery stable. They'll be watching. Glass shattered overhead. A bottle with burning cloth struck the floor, kerosene spreading in a pool of flame. Then another. The old wood of the brewery caught immediately, smoke billowing up through broken rafters. Out the back. Jake grabbed Margaret's arm. They ran through the maze of copper tanks, Wilson's curses fading behind them. The tunnel entrance gaped in the floor, a wooden trapdoor Rosa had marked with chalk. Jake yanked it open. Stone steps descended into darkness. Margaret went first, Jake following. The tunnel air tasted of earth and age. Behind them, fire crackled through the brewery's bones. Their footsteps echoed off brick walls as they ran. Margaret's dress catching on rough edges. 20 yards in, the tunnel branched. Margaret chose left without hesitation. Another branch. Then another. Jake realized Rosa had built not one tunnel, but a network escape route spreading beneath the town like roots. They emerged through a false wall into the livery stable's feed room. Hay dust swirled in afternoon light. Jake peered through slats. Main Street looked normal. Townspeople going about business, unaware of the violence spreading underneath. "We need horses," Jake whispered. "No, we need witnesses." Margaret pulled him toward the door. "The church, if we can reach it." The door exploded inward. 3 men rushed through, not Wilson's hired guns, but townspeople. Mr. Hendricks, the rancher who'd fled Margaret's presence that Sunday. Rodriguez, Jake's own ranch hand. And behind them, impossible as morning snow, stood Judge Harlan. "Mrs. Thornton," the judge's voice shook. "Federal marshals are coming, but not for who you think." Margaret's hand found Jake's. Her fingers were ice. "James sent letters," Harlan continued, "to Washington, to the territorial governor. Everything, the fraud, the murders, Morrison's conspiracy, they've been investigating for months. Then why? Because Marshal Brennan is leading them." Harlan's face went gray. "And Brennan's been bought. He's coming to arrest you for James's murder. The body in the mine, they know it's not James. They're saying you killed the real James 2 years ago and have been hiding it since." Jake stepped forward. "That's insane. Is it?" Hendricks spoke for the first time. "A widow who inherits everything, who remarries within days of her husband's supposed death, who's been sitting on documents worth fortunes." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortable. "Senor Jake, the town. Many believe it. The story makes sense if you don't know better." Through the feed room window, Jake saw riders approaching, 20 at least, all wearing badges, led by a thick-bodied man with gray mutton chops. Marshal Brennan, from the description. But beside him rode another figure that made Jake's blood freeze. Colton, cleaned up, wearing a federal deputy's badge, very much alive and official. "They made him a deputy," Harlan breathed. "God help us. They made Colton a federal officer." Margaret stood straighter, that iron spine Jake had come to know asserting itself. "Then we make our stand. Here. Now. In front of everyone?" "Margaret." "No," Jake started. "Yes." She pulled the documents from inside her dress where she'd hidden them after the brewery fight. "These papers, damn them all. But only if the whole town sees them. Only if we make it impossible to bury." She walked out of the livery stable into Main Street. Jake followed, hand on his Colt. Behind them, Hendricks and Rodriguez flanked them. Judge Harlan hesitated, then joined the group. The federal party reined up 20 feet away. Brennan's badge caught sunlight like an accusation. Colton's scarred face showed satisfaction finally getting his revenge. "Margaret Thornton," Brennan called out, voice carrying to gathering crowds. "You're under arrest for the murder of James Thornton." Margaret raised the documents high. "I have evidence of railroad fraud, land theft, and conspiracy to murder." "Evidence from a murderess means nothing," Colton said. "Surrender the papers and yourself. Maybe the court will show mercy." People emerged from shops, from houses, the Harrisons, the Hendricks family, the Mexican families from the church, soon 50 people, then 100. Formed a circle around the confrontation. Jake saw something shift in Brennan's expression, nervousness at so many witnesses. "Show them," someone called from the crowd. Jake couldn't tell who. Margaret opened the first document. A survey showing the Martinez family's land boundaries moved 3 miles east. She held it high. Signed by Morrison. Witnessed by Collins. Murmurs through the crowd. The Martinez family pushed forward, the eldest son reaching for the paper. "More lies from a desperate woman," Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret pulled out another paper. "The Hendricks Ranch water rights transferred to the railroad without their knowledge." She handed it to Mr. Hendricks, whose face went white reading it. "My signature," Hendricks said loud enough for all to hear. "Forged! That's not my hand." One by one, Margaret distributed documents, each family finding their names, their land, their forged signatures. The crowd's murmur grew to angry voices. Brennan's deputies shifted nervous in their saddles. "Enough." Brennan drew his pistol. "Everyone back. This woman is under arrest." "For what crime, exactly?" The voice came from behind Brennan's group. Everyone turned. Coming down Main Street was another group of riders, but these wore different badges. Federal marshals. Yes, but led by a woman Jake recognized, Dr. Sarah Chen, except now she wore a marshal's badge. "Deputy Marshal Chen," she called out formally. "Special Investigator, Department of Justice, Marshal Brennan. You're relieved of command pending investigation into bribery and conspiracy." Brennan's face went purple. "You can't. I can. I have." Chen produced papers of her own, signed by the Attorney General. "Mr. Colton, you're also under arrest. Your appointment as deputy was fraudulent. You're still wanted for attempted murder." The crowd pressed closer. Jake felt the mood shift from fear to anger to something more dangerous. These people had nearly lost everything. They wanted justice. "The documents," Chen said to Margaret. "We need them for federal evidence." Margaret hesitated. Once she gave them up, her protection was gone. Jake saw her calculate, weigh options. "I'll provide them at the trial," Margaret said. "When I testify, publicly." Chen nodded. "Acceptable. The trial begins Thursday. Federal judge arriving from Denver. Thursday. 3 days to stay alive. 3 days with Morrison's hired guns still out there, with half the town's power structure threatened." Jake touched Margaret's elbow, a question. She leaned slightly into him in answer. "We'll be at the trial," Jake said. Brennan made one last attempt. "This woman murdered her husband. Her husband is alive." Chen interrupted. "James Thornton is in federal custody in Sacramento. He's been testifying to a grand jury for 6 months. The silence was complete. Even the wind stopped. Margaret's composure finally cracked, not with guilt, but with joy. Tears ran down her cheeks as she pressed a hand to her mouth. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's really alive." Jake felt the ground shift again, but differently this time. Not betrayal, but understanding. Everything Margaret had done, every lie, every risk protecting a husband she'd thought dead who'd actually been protecting her from afar. That's when Jake noticed movement on the roof of the Mercantile, sunlight on metal, a rifle barrel tracking toward Margaret. "Gun!" Jake shouted, pulling Margaret down. The shot cracked across Main Street. But it wasn't the sniper who fired. Morning light struck the Mason Ranch house different now. Jake stood on his own porch, watching Margaret tend the horses in the corral. 3 days since the federal judge had taken their testimony. 2 days since Morrison and Collins were transported to federal prison. 1 day since the town learned what Margaret had sacrificed to protect their land rights. She moved among the horses with the same efficiency she brought to ledgers checking hooves, running hands along flanks, murmuring words Jake couldn't hear. Her black mourning dress was gone, replaced by practical cotton the color of prairie sage. The sight still jarred him, Margaret, without her armor. "Coffee's ready." Robert's voice came from behind, careful and measured. His arm hung in a sling, shoulder still healing from the mine shooting. He'd been staying at the ranch since his release from Dr. Chen's care, sleeping in Jake's father's old room. Jake followed him inside. The kitchen smelled of sourdough and bacon fat Robert had taken over cooking. Something about prison teaching a man to make do. They sat at the scarred pine table where Jake's mother had rolled dough, where his father had drunk himself toward the grave. "She's planning to leave." Robert set down his cup. "Saw her looking at stage schedules." Jake's chest tightened. "When? Tomorrow? Maybe? Day after?" Robert studied his coffee like it held answers. "Can't blame her. This town holds nothing but ghosts." Through the window, Jake watched Margaret close the corral gate. She'd saved the ranch. The federal judge had invalidated all fraudulent claims, restored original boundaries. The Mason land was safe, the marriage contract fulfilled. No legal reason for her to stay. Bootsteps on the porch. Margaret entered, bringing the smell of horse and hay. She stopped, seeing both men at the table, something flickering across her face, surprise, maybe disappointment. "Robert, you're up early?" "Habit." He stood, favoring his injured side. "I'll check the north pasture. Fences need work." He left them alone. Margaret poured coffee, movements careful as if the silence might shatter. Jake noticed her wedding ring was gone. When had she removed it? His own still circled his finger. Foreign but familiar now. "We need to talk," she said. Jake nodded. They'd avoided this conversation for 3 days, hiding behind legal depositions and ranch work, but the pretense had run empty. Margaret sat across from him, this close. He could see exhaustion written in the lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. "The federal prosecutor says I'll receive James's death benefits. The real ones. Now that they've established the railroad's fraud. $20,000. That's good. I want to give you half." Jake's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "What?" "10,000. Enough to modernize the ranch, drill that well, buy proper breeding stock." She met his eyes. "You earned it. These 3 weeks, what you've done. What you've risked." "I didn't do it for money." "No." Her laugh held no humor. "Then why duty? Some misguided sense of honor?" Jake set down his cup hard enough to slosh coffee. "You really want to know?" "Yes." He stood, paced to the window. Outside. Horses grazed in the pasture his grandfather had claimed. His father had nearly lost. Margaret had saved. That first day, in the judge's office. You were terrified, trying not to show it. But I could see. The way your hands shook signing those papers. So you felt sorry for me?" "No." Jake turned to face her. "I recognized it. The look of someone trapped by circumstances, making an impossible choice. Same look I saw in the mirror that morning." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Jake, then you showed me those documents. Not for yourself, you could have run, disappeared. But you stayed to protect people who mocked you, shunned you, called you murderous." His voice roughened. "My father drank himself to death thinking he was a failure. You showed me he wasn't, the game was rigged. You gave his death meaning." Margaret stood, moved toward the door. "That's gratitude talking." Jake caught her arm, gentle but firm. "Is it?" She stopped, wouldn't look at him. This close. He could see silver threads in her auburn hair, the faint scar on her neck from that long-ago beating. Beautiful, not despite the damage, but because of it, survival made visible. "I'm 30 years older than you." 29 years, 7 months. Jake had done the math one sleepless night. So what? So you deserve a real wife, children, a future. She pulled free of his grip. Not someone who wakes screaming from nightmares, who can't give you sons, who... Margaret. He said her name quiet, the way he'd learned calmed, spooked horses. "Look at me." She did, and he saw tears she'd never let fall in public. "I don't want some theoretical future wife," he said. "I want the woman who faced down armed men with candles wrapped in red paper, who memorized every ledger in the county to protect strangers, who taught me more about ranching in 2 weeks than my father did in 20 years. That's not love. That's..." He kissed her, not passionate, not desperate. Soft, careful, a question more than statement. She went rigid, then slowly, like ice melting, kissed him back. When they separated, she was crying fully now. "Jake, I can't..." Wagon wheels outside. They moved apart as visitors arrived, half the town from the sound of it. Through the window, Jake saw the Hendricks family, the Mexican families whose land had been saved, even Mrs. Harrison in her fancy carriage. "What's this?" Margaret wiped her eyes, composing herself. They went outside. 20 wagons had pulled into the yard. People climbed down carrying tools, lumber, baskets of food. Mrs. Rodriguez approached, her weathered face soft with something Jake had never seen directed at Margaret respect. "Senora Thornton, we came to say thank you." "I don't." "You saved our farm." Mr. Hendricks stepped forward, hat in hand. "All our farms. The judge showed us the documents, told us what you risked." Mrs. Harrison descended from her carriage, silk dress incongruous among the work clothes. She approached Margaret, chin high but eyes uncertain. "I owe you an apology," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "My husband, the insurance fraud. You could have exposed us, ruined us, but you didn't mention it in your testimony." Margaret's voice came steady. "Your children didn't deserve to suffer for their father's choices." Mrs. Harrison's composure cracked. "The fire at your house. We heard about Rosa, about everything lost. So we brought," she gestured to the wagons, "lumber for rebuilding, furniture, what we could gather." People began unloading chairs, dishes, a rocking chair that looked handmade. The Mexican families had brought chickens, goats, seed for planting. Someone had even saved books from the subscription library, knowing Margaret's love of reading. Jake watched Margaret try to maintain control as the community she'd protected finally acknowledged her sacrifice. Her hand found his, fingers interlacing. The touch said what words couldn't stay. "Please, help me bear this." "We're building a cabin," Jake announced. "On the north corner of the property. Could use help raising the walls." Men nodded, started organizing work crews. Women set up outdoor kitchens. Children ran between wagons, their laughter foreign but welcome on land that had seen too much sorrow. By noon, foundation stones were laid. Margaret worked alongside everyone, her dress soaked with sweat, dirt under her nails. Jake caught her smiling reel, unguarded as Mrs. Rodriguez taught her Spanish curse words while they mortared stones. Robert appeared with his fiddle, the one he'd hidden at the ranch before prison. Music filled the yard, jigs, reels, Mexican canciones. People danced on packed earth while walls rose timber by timber. As sunset approached, the cabin stood complete, one room, but solid, with windows facing the mountains. The crowd began dispersing, leaving gifts inside quilts, preserves, a Bible with pressed flowers. Jake and Margaret stood alone finally, looking at what the community had built. "It's too small," Margaret said. "We can add on." She turned to him. "Jake, I haven't agreed. Marry me." The words came out sure, certain. "Not for the ranch, not for protection, because I choose you." Margaret's breath caught. "We're already married." "That was a contract. Business." Jake pulled his mother's ring from his pocket, gold worn thin but unbroken. This would be real. She looked at the ring, at the cabin, at the sun setting behind mountains that had watched so much pain, and now, maybe, something better. "I can't give you children." "Don't want them." "I have nightmares." "So do I." "I'm old." "You're experienced, smart, beautiful." He took her hand, felt it trembling. "You're the woman I choose." Margaret took the ring, turned it so sunset caught the gold. "Your mother's, she would have liked you." Strong women recognize each other. Robert emerged from the main house, fiddle under his arm. He'd changed into his best shirt, the one from before prison. "Figured you might need a witness." Margaret laughed, surprised, genuine. "You knew. Jake's been carrying that ring for 2 days." Robert positioned himself like a preacher would stand. "So what's it going to be? Sister? First time he'd called her that since learning the truth about James's death, how he'd sacrificed himself to buy time for Margaret to hide the documents, how Morrison had tortured him for their location, how he'd died protecting others. Margaret looked at Jake, this young man who'd become her partner, protector, equal, who saw her not as the widow, the victim, or the savior, but simply as herself. "Yes," she said. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly over the indentation left by the first ring, as if it had always belonged there. Robert played something soft, sweet, a melody that sounded like home. Jake kissed Margaret as the last sunlight faded, as lamps began glowing in their new cabin, as the land their blood had bought settled into peace. When they separated, Margaret was crying again, but differently, like rain after drought, necessary and healing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Mason," Jake said. She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked young. "Welcome home, Mr. Thornton?" He laughed at that, taking her name instead of giving his. Why not? They'd already broken every other convention. Hand in hand, they walked toward the cabin. Behind them, Robert's fiddle carried across the valley, telling their story in notes instead of words, sorrow transformed to joy, duty become love, two souls finding each other in the last place anyone would look. The door closed soft behind them. Through the window, lamplight spilled gold onto ground that would, come spring, grow gardens. Inside, barely audible, came the sound of laughter. Margaret's, free at last. High above, stars emerged one by one, mapping out a future neither had imagined but both had chosen, written not in contracts or blood, but in the simple, revolutionary act of staying. 6 months later, I visited the Mason Ranch to document this story. Margaret served coffee in china cups that had survived the fire rescued by Rosa before she lit that fuse. Jake's hands bore new calluses from building their expanded cabin. Robert played his fiddle on the porch, the same songs that had carried across the valley during their second wedding. What struck me wasn't their happiness, though it was evident in every shared glance, every casual touch. It was their ordinariness. Here were two people who'd faced down corruption, survived attempts on their lives, rebuilt from ashes, yet they discussed cattle prices, argued gently about where to plant corn, laughed at Robert's terrible jokes. Margaret showed me James's real grave, finally, a simple stone marked "Beloved Husband." No dates. Some stories, she said, don't fit on tombstones. She told me Rosa had written once from California, running a boarding house under her real name. The federal judge had ensured the land redistributions held. Even Mrs. Harrison had become, if not a friend, then an ally in protecting what they'd all nearly lost. That's what I want you to understand sometimes. Love grows not from perfect circumstances, but from shared survival. From choosing each other when choosing to run would be easier. Disclaimer. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, promote, or encourage any form of violence, illegal activity, or harmful behavior of any kind. All characters, events, and locations depicted are entirely products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. The historical setting and circumstances are fictional constructs designed to serve the narrative and should not be interpreted as historically accurate representations or endorsements of any actions described within.